Do you recognise this? Now, love it or loathe it, that is the sound that is becoming increasingly familiar to more and more of us, with parakeets nesting in thousands of locations across the UK this spring. But what does this so-called green invasion mean for other wildlife? And should the bright long-tailed birds even be returned to captivity? I'm Lucy Watson, and this is What You Need to Know. Well, joining me is Choi. Now, he is our consumer editor, but slightly off brief this. And I suppose, actually, the title of this podcast shouldn't be What You Need to Know. It should be What I Need to Know. Why the interest in parakeets, Chris?
I can't explain it. It's not just an interest, it became an obsession. But you know what? This actually is replicated across the country because these garden visitors have arrived, adding the exotic to our parks and gardens. And once you start looking into their origins, it is so fascinating. How they got here is wrapped in mythology. There's a touch, as I hope we'll talk about, of show business, of Hollywood, of celebrity. There's
Celebrity parakeets we're talking about.
A celebrity link.
Okay. Now, I confess I come at this chat kind of completely cold, other than the fact I know exactly the birds you're talking about because I've seen them in the tree in my front garden when I'm doing my makeup in the mirror. They're right there in that tree. And they're also really quite
Who's
common.
preening most, them or you?
I confess it will definitely be me. And also I see them a lot in the park that's directly in front of my boy's school, my son's school.
Yeah.
But I was told by my in-laws that they escaped from London Zoo. Is that wrong?
I've told you, the origin story of the UK parakeets is wrapped in mythology.
Come on then, shed some light on it. What's the truth?
Let me just, first of all, just to explain what they're like. If they're in your garden, you know about it pretty quickly. You'll probably hear them before you see them. They've got a very distinctive squawk. Then when you get closer, you'll see this emerald green plumage. You'll see a bright red beak, and very distinctively, they have a kind of rose-tinted collar, and they're actually called ring-necked parakeets. Now, how did they get here? When you consider where they came from, if you imagine the Himalayas and just south of there, you've got India and Pakistan, that is where they started out.
Okay.
And the Himalayas, by the way, is a bit of a clue as to why they do so well converting to our climate. But there's not a single...
They can cope with a chill, you mean?
Yeah, they are. They're quite okay with our temperature range. But then the big question that you've already asked is, how did they get here?
Yeah.
One thing's for sure, not one of them flew. It's far too far. So let's go through the myths. So first of all, there's one that is really famous. A lot of people have heard this, which is that in 1951, there was a film called The African Queen. It had Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. It's rather a good film. And if you ever watch the film, it's set in a jungle, but about half of it was actually filmed on the outskirts of London. The story goes that at some stage during that production, they were let loose. And they became...
So the parakeets were in this film?
They were in this film along with an awful lot of other exotic birds.
Right.
So that is one of the theories.
Mm-hmm.
The next is even more exotic. I mean, forget Hollywood. Next, we're into Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix publicly released two of these things.
Oh, I have heard that one.
In 1966. So again, people thought, wow, this is possibly where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps the most recent story for them is that during those big storms of 1987, quite a lot of aviaries blew down, and that's where en masse they got into our population. Well,
so my theory is not impossible. They could have been in London.
it's not impossible. It's not impossible, but what was necessary was the kind of science that is normally deployed for tracking down serial killers. Yeah. Honestly,
Right. I'm not sure where you're going.
It's a branch of criminology called geographic profiling. And what has been done by a professor at University College London, Tim Blackburn, is he's used this technique to find out the real story. And it seems to be that in the 1950s, stretching a little bit into the 60s, there was a big news story shocking people in the papers about parrot flu, that you could get this kind of parrot fever, which can affect humans, affect their lungs, big scare stories about it. And that coincided with a period in our history of pet keeping where parrots were fairly popular, parrots and parakeets. And the theory, which is now established as the leading theory, is that around that time in the 50s, people panicked and let them out.
Okay.
Perhaps not expecting them to thrive. And the reason why we think that that is the number one theory is because little isolated releases from a film set, from a rock star, couldn't account for the density of the population we have now. It had to be much wider geographically.
So how many are there then, like nesting in the UK? How many have taken up residence here?
What happens is that hundreds and hundreds of bird spotters keep a careful register of how many of these parakeets there are around the country. And the British Trust for Ornithology compiles all of the records once a year and works out how many they are. Now, they give me a list now of all the places that are now really populated colonies, call them what you'd like. So we've got big ones around London, which is where the whole thing started. But now from Plymouth to Aberdeen come these reports, which are just in. So Oxford, Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, Nottingham, Glasgow, Edinburgh, overall more than a 2,000% increase.
And hold on, pardon the pun, but a little birdie told me that you went to Belfast yesterday in search of them.
They're in Belfast where they're ruffling some feathers. We'll come to that in a second.
Should we quit it? Should we quit it right there?
Let me just introduce you to Viola Ross-Smith from the British Trust for
Okay, let's listen from the expert, shall we?
Because she has gathered all this information and it's just been released about where these parakeets are and the density of the population, wild now in the UK.
It's basically going up and up and up. It seems kind of unstoppable. In terms of the population trend, since 1995, we've seen an increase of more than 2,000%, almost doubled in the last 10 years, up by almost a third in the last 5 years. So there's no signs of that stopping at all. Interestingly, though, the numbers are increasing a lot in urban areas and the strongholds where they're already established. They're not really spreading in range. So they're gradually going from city to city, but they're not, kind of taking over the whole countryside and painting it green.
Now, she says they're not taking over, but are they classed as an invasive species?
They are.
Can they have an impact on like the native wildlife that are...
Yeah, they are categorised as an invasive species, as aliens. And that categorisation exists because of the threat to our native species. Threat, first of all, when it comes to food. Anybody that's seen them in parks and gardens might have seen they're not quite bird table bullies, but they can swarm around and they've got a really effective technique. I've seen them
a voracious appetite as well.
Very, very much so. It's also nesting because they are crevice nesters. They look for holes in trees or similar structures where they can get in there. But those nesting sites are also needed by sparrows, a depleting population of them, starlings, also under threat in certain places, and blue tits, which a lot of people are great fans of.
My little boy, they're his favourite bird.
So you'll see why there is concern. And although at the moment there's not that much evidence in this country of them being destructive when it comes to farming, in Belgium there is some evidence, and farmers, particularly of soft fruits, and the now up-and-coming vineyards around Kent are concerned that, as we've heard at the moment, they're kind of leapfrogging from city to city and using urban conurbations as their stepping stones. There is a fear that in time they'll spread out more into the countryside and become more of a threat to agriculture.
So what can we do then about protecting the species, the wildlife that was already here?
Well, you've led us almost effortlessly to Belfast.
Anyone would think I did it for a living.
Where we have been filming. Now, in Belfast, it's an interesting story because there aren't that many of the parakeets there at the moment. They reckon about 15 of them in Waterworks Park. So in a sense, they still have an opportunity to do something. In Belfast, there are a lot of starlings and they create what's called a murmuration. I don't know whether you're familiar with how that looks, but it's where the skyline...
I don't know, but I like the sound of the word.
Isn't it? I love the word,
Murmuration,
murmuration. And it's when the skyline almost darkens because so many starlings get together, swirl around.
Yeah, it's quite beautiful. I always think that about
beautiful.
geese. I love seeing geese in flight migrating.
And starling, just the same, and hundreds of people gather in Belfast to see them every year. It particularly happens in January. Now, there's a group called Wild Belfast who's saying don't take things like this for granted because it's a very delicate ecosystem. And if we allow invaders, and that's what these parakeets are, an alien invader, if we allow them to come in, and remember they're competing for the same space when it comes to nesting sites, there's a problem. So now the suggestion in Belfast, where this discussion has really reached a flashpoint, is that those living wild should be caught, humanely trapped, captured and returned to captivity. We spoke to Conor McKinney from Wild Belfast.
There's various different opportunities that are available. We already know where some of the nesting cavities are. We could be looking at exclosures, for instance, to prevent them from using those. We could also be looking at mist netting, nets that are put up. They're practically invisible to birds, and then we could collect them by hand once they fly into them. There's multiple opportunities.
So this whole idea about returning them to captivity, is that popular then?
Well, there are so many people that are fans.
Not with you, maybe?
Well, the jury's out where I'm concerned.
Okay.
Possibly we've left it too late when it comes to the ringneck parakeets.
Because there are just so many of them.
There are just so many now, but people are keeping a very, 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 very careful watch on them. So many of us like them. They've won our bird tables. They've won our hearts. They are this wonderful splash of colour. Especially at this time of year when they're nesting, a lot of people are fascinated by them, but they're not naturally here. You know, they are living, some people think, on borrowed time. If they do become a problem, there will be more and more demands to take action. So parakeets might be beautiful, might be exotic, but there's also that touch of controversy as well.
Chris, thank you so much for shedding an awful lot of light. I do like all the mythology around it. I think that's really, really nice and fun. Remember, you can subscribe to What You Need to Know wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And you can watch full episodes on Spotify, YouTube, and of course on ITVX. Until our next quick briefing, though, thanks for joining us.